I want to start by quoting Rita McGrath, who is also a Columbia professor, and she's a guru in entrepreneurship and innovation. And what she's talking about now, and I love that phrase, she's saying the future cannot be planned, it should be discovered. And I think that that's where we're in right now. We're in the discovery. And if you're hearing answers to the questions that we're asking now, then you're not hearing the right answers. I think we should be looking for questions. And that's where I appreciate the work that Josh is doing and the work that we are all engaged in looking at what's actually emerging. Because it's very easy to be looking for patterns in the past, but a lot of what's coming in and the weak signals and how we are going to actually work in the future, post-vaccine, I've heard that now it's not even post-COVID, it's post-vaccine environment we're going to be in. That new a new workplace is still emerging, and there are weak signals that we need to pick up on, as well as trying not to impose too much of that past perspective. That's what I want to focus on. At the same time, so as we're gathering data, it's very, very important to gather data. We also have to be listening to stories. And I think it's a combination of looking at what's happening and at graphs and numbers, as well as capturing the stories of people who are living in those environments and listening to the employees who are just in the midst of this experience. We don't know where we're going to end up. The one thing that I really don't want to talk about is the new normal. I think we're all a little bit tired of that phrase. So let's put ourselves in this position of discovery and see what's emerging. And in some ways, you know, Peter and I did exactly that just a few years ago. I think we partnered in 2016 when we realized at the time when everyone was kind of looking at performance management that there are new signals that are emerging about how to do performance management differently. And that's what led us to a whole series of conversations, multiple conversations with companies around what they were doing, what kinds of issues they were trying to solve for. And Peter will speak to what we've discovered and how it connects to some of the specifics of what performance looks like now in the social distancing and remote working environment, and what it will be when we get to that post-vaccine phase of this crisis. And from performance management that Peter will talk about, we also discovered agility, how it was coming into HR. HR became curious about what this agility is and how it was different from the supply chains, the lean, the Six Sigmas that preceded the agile phase. And so indeed, the conversations led to digital transformation and the tools that were coming in and technology companies that were transforming themselves, adjusting to the new ways of working. And I think the acceleration we're experiencing now, some of it is a function of overnight digitization. Some of the companies we talked to, I revisited them recently, and they said, yes, we had a 2-year plan to transition to agility and digital, and we had work groups set up, and we had the charts and the war rooms set up, and all of it happened within 2 weeks. So that's an acceleration that we've experienced with this epidemic. But, and you hear the sirens at the back because I'm also in New York City. So just a little bit of the history, and then I will pass it over to Peter and then jump back in again. So what we've noticed was without the crisis, the need to accelerate because the business models were changing, and they were changing in certain industries, not universally. And the courageous individual HR leaders like Diane Gerson from IBM, Donna Morris from Adobe at that time. So it did take leadership to listen to those trends, look at those trends, and have the political capital and the courage to actually move their organizations in the right direction. So they're the ones that were actually most prepared for what happened overnight. They're the ones fighting the norms of the time that pioneered remote working, that were looking at different ways of collaborating, and were focused on innovation. So that's how we highlighted agility and looked at how it specifically transformed some of the HR processes. And I want to actually call on Peter to reflect on how he thinks performance management is changing right now under the conditions of remote working. But before that, I also want to say that there will be a new trends that we're not aware of that are just coming to the surface. And I agree, Josh, that it's amazing to see how quickly we could transform, but I also would not think that rallying around the flag and responding to a crisis is sustainable. A lot of people, to your point, are working overtime, and we are not there yet to see. We're still in the process of flattening the curve and still fighting the virus. We are not here yet to see where we're going to end up. And some of the beginnings of the solutions are emerging, but it's too early to say. And I just want to encourage all of us, and this is where the academics, the researchers, the analysts are coming in with the right questions, looking for the trends, for the weak signals, and hopefully eventually, sooner rather than later, we are going to be in that new workplace that is so needed. Peter, what do you think about performance management and how it's transforming itself right now?
Thank you, Anna. So I'll say a little bit about performance management, particularly around this topic of working from home, which is making the performance management question particularly salient. But let me spend 1 minute on the big think topics we've been talking about and the extent to which the current virus and shutdown is a learning opportunity. It certainly is, but it is important to remember that we don't always learn from these opportunities. If you look back at the Great Recession, which was unfortunately not that long ago, right? About a decade, and it lingered for a very long time. And if you'd ask yourself, what did we learn from that? I think you'd be hard pressed to say what we learned and actually adjusted to. It was a very low probability event that ended up being catastrophic for the economy. What did we do to prevent that? Again, maybe not much, right? And one of the problems that we have with respect to trying to be so flexible and adaptable and move quickly is that we find it difficult to take the long-term view on much of anything. And because we don't take the long-term view, we don't learn very much, partly because we're not so concerned about the future. Our tenure as CEO is pretty short. My time in this particular job might not be very long. What happens 10 years out? I don't know. I'm not going to be here. It's not particularly relevant for me. And partly because of that, there's a lot of low probability events like the current coronavirus, which take some real long-term investments and a long-term perspective if we want to solve these. It's not something we're going to solve quickly. And if we solve it for this particular virus with a vaccine, it's not going to help us with the next pandemic that comes down the pike. So, we need a commitment to thinking long-term, as well as to being flexible and adaptable in the earlier periods. I think Anna was the person who pushed us to thinking about agile and what it meant, and maybe come back to her in a minute and talk a little bit about how Agile has been reinterpreted in ways which, are not maybe not always terrific, right? But let's talk about working from home for just a bit here. One of the things we can see is that a lot of it is going on. And the difference now, there's a Gallup poll that found that 72% of Americans say they had been working from home, but there's a huge difference between what that meant, which was people cutting out on Friday afternoons to take calls from home to start the weekend, and being out of your office for months at a time and never going back in. And one of the things that we know about this now is that most organizations, as Josh was saying, they didn't have a plan for this. We didn't do much of anything. We just sent people home and said, try to do your jobs, right? And we knew a fair bit before doing this about what works in terms of managing people from a distance. We didn't apply much of any of that, frankly. And the interesting thing will be, what do we do when we bring people back? So I saw a survey of C-level folks, or at least it claimed to be of C-level folks, that's saying it was quite surprising, stunning finding about what their big concerns were going forward. And the biggest of the concerns that they said they faced was how to manage a remote workforce going forward. That was their top priority. And when asked what was the thing that they thought was most important to learn about afterwards, the question or the answer was learning about how to manage remote workers. So, this is something that's certainly on people's minds. Are we going to learn anything from it? Well, what do we know right now? There's another Gallup poll out saying that 59% of Americans say that they would like to do more working from home than when the virus is over and we go back to work. They would like to do more of it than they have been doing. I wouldn't take that as evidence that it's going to happen, though, right? Because the problem is we really don't know whether this is going to have worked or not. But here's a reason for thinking that it probably did not work. Think about all the time and effort that we spend, particularly around human resources, trying to motivate people in the workplace, okay? And we do that with office design, removing distractions, giving people all the assets there, having your boss there, having your peers, having a structured environment that eliminates distractions. And we're going to take all that away and we're going to send you home with your family and your kids and your distractions. And we think that's going to work better. Well, that's a pretty good bet, a big bet. And I wouldn't particularly want to bet on that, right? So the question is going to be, though, can we persuade our organizations to learn something from this experience once we start trying to bring people back? Here's what I think we're going to learn, and here's what I think we ought to try to do right now. The first thing is we need to have consistent policies. So up until now, the way most companies have managed working at a distance is it was entirely up to your immediate supervisor. In this part of the business, you could work from home. In this other part, doing the same job, you couldn't. And the reason is your boss in the second place just assumed everybody was lazy, and if you weren't watching them, they would be watching Gilligan's Island all day. We can't have that anymore, and my guess is that's one thing that will change even when we come back, is that we will have department-wide or company-wide policies, and we need to have that right now. I think we've probably already got it, or at least have it going right now. The second thing we have to do is get better at managing performance. And that means when you're working from home, what is it we actually want you to do? What are we going to measure when you are done with your job at the end of this week? How often are we going to check up, and what are we going to be checking? The thing is that we don't do that very now when people are in the workplace, right? So I was talking to a vendor today who had this great idea. They said, well, why don't we just look at the performance differences from people working from home compared to those when they were working in the office? I said, that's a great idea, except we don't have any performance measures of how people were doing in the office, or most places don't, right? So trying to figure out how to manage people from a distance, something we know a fair bit about, but it means we got to tell them what we want them to do, what we're going to measure. We got to measure it. We have to keep checking in with them. One of the things that Anna and I learned was the big revelation of this performance management revolution was the importance of moving away from bureaucratic tick the box exercises, which weren't doing any good and everybody hated them, towards something more like continual feedback. So we got to do that. And we have to start doing that from a distance as well. The last issue, let me just raise it, which is a profound one, maybe we could talk about later, is now we've done such a good job persuading people of the importance to do social distancing and stay home that now we got a problem getting them to come back. The majority of Americans say they're much more concerned about coming back to work than they are about waiting too long to restart the economy. So, you know, the problem is we got to persuade them to come back now. And that is going to be an HR informed exercise. First, to persuade them why it's important to come back, why we need their help, and also why taking some risk is part of life. We've been doing such a terrific job trying to drive the risks down to zero by staying home, but we can't do that forever, right? So we got to do that. We got to persuade them that the place is going to be safe. And if we could at least get that far, that would be terrific. Part of that, though, is going to require being able to persuade them that the home environment and the office environment are not so different. We're going to have to do social distancing in the office. We're going to have to persuade them that the place is clean. We're going to have to do all those things, which we have probably never done before. But I think the big thing, if there's a structural change going forward from this, is can we use this opportunity to learn something? And that requires a different mindset. If we could do that, we could start learning all the time, even from the things that are not nearly as dramatic as this coronavirus experience. Anna, we got a few minutes left. Let me turn it back to you, Anna, and ask you, cold call you now, and ask you about Agile, and what do you think is happening to Agile in this new environment? Certainly the small group kind of Agile stuff is pretty difficult to pull off, right?
Yeah. I think, Peter, I second your concern about too much confidence about how we've changed overnight. That's where I started. We know very little about how to build those collaborative cultures, how to build collaborative teams entirely online. Because what's going on now is sort of we are leveraging, we are using the social capital that's been created prior to the crisis. So people were just sent home to work from home, and yes, it's working for as long as those relationships are still in place. What we don't know, and I'm not saying necessarily that it's not going to happen, but we really don't know how you can build the whole organizations if the majority of your people are going to be fully remote. And all the conversations are taking us back to technologies available to us. We know very little about the psychology of what's going on. And I wouldn't be too pessimistic, but I also am saying that we do not know. This research is just beginning to happen. And I think it's going to be difficult to say how the agility that you and I have been writing about, that's created from a face-to-face interactions, from constant communication between the team, visible and invisible science, and kind of the camaraderie, esprit de corps that creative, innovative teams have created, how it's possible to replicate unless you're using, augmented reality, virtual reality. That's where we are going, again, through technology. But this is still very unknown. And I think we're going to be, the best we can do is to continue learning, continue asking questions, and continue to listen to stories so that we can reconstruct discover that future that's coming and not plan for it.
And let me leave you with my little last possible learning thing here. One of the things I think everybody is learning is they're saying, gosh, I'm so sick of these Zoom meetings at work already, right?
Yeah.
And if that's true, weren't we sick of meetings in the office too? And the answer was, yes, we were. So can't we do something about that? It's just reminded us that we've got probably too many meetings. They're not very productive. We've known this for a while. Why don't we do something about it? We all understand that now. Can we have the political will inside organizations to do something about it?
Thank you both. There's a timelessness in the points that you raised because there's still gap between the aspired capabilities and awareness that are required to be agile. I was taken by the notion of what is the impact of having Zoom be in our homes literally. We've probably all heard lots of funny stories about camera mishaps or what happens when the pristine veneers that we developed in our work cells are pierced by a puppy or insert here. But also, it's not just those comedic instances, it's the CEO who we have total reward structures around based on a persona of being in a particular class, having an education, and then discovering at a time like this that they have a sibling that has a mental disorder from a different class, not educated. So our treatment of the employee and demonstrating or reacting to a notion of wellness, relevance, commitment. Do you see anything in your walks or have any thoughts about how having a more authentic understanding of who we are and the bonds that come from crisis, what can we take from that to reinvent, whether it's how we pay people or what we consider benefits or how we think about the person as a whole?
I think it's a terrific opportunity for leaders to ask for help from their employees. We need your help, right? And the problem is that you could seize this opportunity. We are in this together, right? The problem is if after asking for their help, you act as if then we're not in this together, right? If you do as we're starting to see some of our bigger companies do now, they're backing away from some of the things that they had done for their employees in the first month of this virus experience, right? And if you turn completely back to focusing on costs and shareholder value and you start slashing jobs and, you know, we need your help, we're really in this together. People want to feel like they are contributing. I think that's why so many people are so adamant about staying home now. It's an incredible sacrifice, but they feel like it is the right thing to do. It's such an opportunity for business leaders to seize that, but you can't be a hypocrite about it. And that's the big dilemma. Will they be able to execute this? It's pretty easy to do until it comes to having to sustain it, and then we got a problem.
And to your earlier point, Yvette, I think we're going to experience very different categories of diversity and inclusion. Something that's never been an issue around, you know, family members, to your point. You know, this working from home means, you know, what kind of home do you have? The inequities that are coming up that never really impacted the performance in the office because everyone was in the same more or less space and with the same boundaries. All of a sudden, what we call in research contaminants, all of these unexpected contaminants in the family, with the family, for example. And what we're hearing from some of the leaders I do is saying, you know, we are really getting 80% of the performance from 15% of the employees because of these circumstances at home. So how this is going to be resolved in terms of, to Peter's point about how we're going to be even measuring performance and what kinds of goals are we going to set is very, very unknown, and it depends on the company you're in. And also, obviously, in the same company, if it's a diversified business, you have essential workers. I talked to a few of my colleagues in pharmaceutical companies, for example, and they have the fortunate people who are working from home and can carry on with their jobs. and there are people in manufacturing in the front lines that are in very different situations. And how do you evaluate the risk? How you factor in the risk in their performance evaluation? So there are lots of questions that we need to be asking right now, I think, in addition to kind of looking at the numbers and trying to figure out where the trends are going.
Right. That's an excellent point, and understand the relationship between the two. And the point that you made, Anna, about essential skills, the notion that we could have leaders that when they hear the words essential in one setting, in a crisis setting, means those people who are most at risk, least have a line of sight into internally what businesses call those key talent segments, so that critical workforce segment. And, you know, knowing that connectivity between externals, the main core of business, those skills that are aligned, that's a different behind the doors conversation than essential workers, and reconciling the incongruence between government workers, those that are on the front lines that are touching our lives literally every day, and reconciling, going back to the Lincoln question, the relationship between our purpose as people and the role of capital in sustaining business and us. So thank you for that.